The Fourth Way Up, Chapter 16, Development of the Intellectual Center. Gurdjieff not accidentally called his schools opened in different countries, institutes for the harmonious development of man. Disharmony in the human psyche has always led to one or another difficult problem. That is especially true for the case of self-development. A person with a poorly developed motor, emotional, or intellectual center cannot solve those complex development problems that arise on the fourth way. As a rule, the lack of development of any center leads to a misunderstanding of the methods of the fourth way. One student, for example, did not catch the difference between the methods of yoga and the fourth way. Another student could not understand the difference between the fourth way and traditional Christianity. Yet another individual could not understand why the theory of the fourth way is needed. He believed that only practical work with the emotional and motor centers solves the problems of self-realization. Therefore, one of the fourth way's main tasks is harmonizing students' psyche centers. This is why development on the fourth way is so personal. The leader must correctly assess the degree of development of each student's centers and give him individual tasks to eliminate disharmony. Of course, such work will require a lot of effort and time, but there is no other way. Development on the fourth way is based on working with three centers: intellectual, emotional, and motor. Strictly speaking, the essential difference between this path and all other paths of development is the specific work on developing the intellectual part of the emotional center, E3. This part of the emotional center is very finely organized and is the door to the higher emotional center. However, one should never underestimate the importance of developing the intellectual center. Working on the theoretical provisions of the fourth way develops the intellectual part of students' intellectual center, I3. Unfortunately, modern man has replaced most of the work of this higher part of the intellectual center with the functioning of the automatic part of that center, the formatory apparatus, I1. People use the intellectual part of the motor center, M3, to solve those intellectual problems that the formatory apparatus cannot handle. Thinking at these levels is reduced to searching for clichés and sticking labels. The incomprehensible is explained by the supposedly understandable. Creative thinking is absent here. Gurdjieff claimed that such intellectual thinking is characteristic of most people in our society. Such a primitive level of individual consciousness forms a low level of public consciousness. Society always has mechanisms for suppressing the growth of people's consciousness. This is not only vodka and tobacco, but also a system of processing the human mind by the media. During the Soviet era, in addition to the crude censorship system, the so-called temporary difficulties methods were used. People had to make ends meet with difficulty and waste a lot of time solving problems of basic life support, endless queues, and shortages of goods. In prosperous countries, people's consciousness is loaded with idiotic clichés of consumer society. There, people have their own problems, no less severe than in poor countries, that hinder the development of consciousness. However, all countries of the world are characterized by the same disharmony in the development of the mental centers of the overwhelming majority of residents. Solving various problems of both theoretical and practical types with the help of the Enneagram, using the second expansion of the Law of Three, and for particular issues also, the third expansion, requires a great deal of tension in the genuinely intellectual and emotional centers. The result is a multifaceted vision of the phenomenon being studied. High-quality solutions appear. In the process of such work, knowledge turns into understanding. The growth of the researcher's being occurs. In addition to the conventional intellectual problems of the fourth way, various kinds of educational games are offered in groups. These include traditional Japanese checkers, Go, and brainstorming methods. For example, the initial conditions of the brainstorming sounded like this. There is a civil war in the country. We are on one of the islands of the Volga River. Around us are mountains of empty beer cans and empty bottles. We have the simplest tools. We need to do something to survive. There are villages on the banks of the Volga where we can exchange our products for food. A well-coordinated team, as a certain kind of intellectual machine, by moving to new, more creative levels of consciousness, can solve problems that clearly exceed the capabilities of an individual. Gurdjieff was an example of an inventive person with an open, liberated mind. In his work, he used the higher parts of the centers. Many people were fascinated when reading the chapter The Material Question from Gurdjieff's famous book, Meetings with Remarkable People. The master himself says this about himself. Thanks to ingenuity, breadth of vision, and above all common sense, developed in me by proper upbringing, I became able to grasp the most essential from all the information that I intentionally or accidentally collected in the subsequent period of my life, leaving aside various empty rubbish. End of quote. Or, the work had meaning and interest for me, not in itself, but only as a new, unknown occupation. End of quote. And also, as a result, I acquired knowledge and skills in a huge number of professions. I will also add that I owe my fame today in various countries as a representative of true knowledge in many fields of science, partly to this upbringing. End of quote. As already mentioned, in addition to the methods of the fourth way and brainstorming for the development of the intellectual center, the fourth way schools use the ancient Chinese game Go, which has unique and universal properties for the development of the higher parts of the intellectual and emotional centers. Due to its effect, the game activates the emotional part of the intellectual center, I2, dramatically increasing the efficiency of this center's development. At the peak of perfection, the game Go allows one to activate the intellectual part of the emotional center. But most importantly, with all the simplicity of the rules, this game has a vast number of options. When playing, one must not identify with a specific place of action, but keep one's attention on the entire battlefield. To be successful in the game, one must constantly manage his attention span and almost simultaneously solve strategic and tactical problems. Undoubtedly, the player, having won or lost, should not give free rein to his emotions. That is additional training, which is rather serious. In ancient Japanese paintings, the final stage of the game of Go is depicted as a sword fight, and that is the case despite all the restraint typical for the ancient samurai culture. Go is undoubtedly more complex than chess and better develops the intellect. For training and control of the formatory apparatus, I1, fourth way groups use the following method. The group selects by voting several words, the use of which is considered the most mechanical. If a student wants to use this word consciously, he must say, I quote, before the forbidden word. These selected words usually include parasite words, drawn-out sounds, and personal pronouns. Well, I, kind of, etc. When the student says a selected word mechanically, he must pay a fine. The money from the fines goes to buy sweets for tea. This harmless game greatly disciplines the automatic part of the intellectual center. People learn to listen to each other and do not slide into chatter. Subsequently, students, comparing such classes with classes without control, vigorously advocate for control of the formatory apparatus. In conclusion of this chapter, we will say that the excessive development of some centers at the expense of others, as well as the insufficient development of any center, is a serious obstacle on the fourth way.